I'm going to talk about the meaning of place for refugees whose histories and lives are mobile and who don't necessarily have a home or homeland to return to show how, specifically how Hmong-Americans create the Central Valley as home through literature. And I just want to say that I'm an interdisciplinary trained scholar in kind of ethnic studies, but interdisciplinary humanities. So literature is just one site in which I examine the politics of place and home and the refugee. So when we think about refugees, we tend to think about it in relation to humanitarian crises resulting from political conflicts. And we see lots of that happening now with the global war on terror, the conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere. And so the United Nations durable solution for refugees is either to repatriate refugees, right, once there's stability in the country, or to resettle them in another country. And this is what's happening. And in fact, not much attention has been paid to the moments in between. So the movement and the living in refugee camps, which oftentimes become indefinite for a lot of refugee groups. And then of course, the time after resettlement, right? Because once refugees become resettled, we don't tend to think of them as refugees anymore. And so for my work, I purposefully highlight these moments in between of movement and resettlement as connected to this longer history of war and migration for the refugees, so that even after resettlement, refugees maintain that condition of impossibility for home and place and for movement. So for groups like Hmong and also Kurds in this context who do not have a geopolitical homeland or whose histories are mobile, repatriation or resettlement remains a vexed issue because they continue to endure long-term refugee conditions of movement and unbelonging. And I examine migration and politics, geopolitics through this Hmong refugee figure as a figure of overlapping colonial administration and military operation. So from refugee studies scholars, refugee is the subject of freedom and militarization, and my work shows how the refugee is a figure who is simultaneously displaced and diasporic. Right? So it articulates a refugee as a figure of knowledge and power that disrupts the relationship between state sovereignty and the political positions of peoples who do not dominate any nation state. So first, here it is. I wanted to just give, this is a short, brief context for understanding how Hmong is simultaneously diasporic and displaced. And it is this diasporic refugee condition of precarious mobility and impermanent status of their history, language, and home, what I'm calling history on the run. So here's just a kind of rudimentary map of southern China, Southeast Asia, and within this rectangle is where Hmong historically lived and still live, right? And are moving around across different borders. And then of course, the second notion of displacement come from the political position of being stateless and rightless as refugees that emerged from the US so-called secret war in Laos during the Vietnam War, right? So this is a CIA secret document of the war, the ground war in Laos, and the enlargement is the area in which Hmong fought on the ground with the CIA for the US. And it's this deliberate silencing of this history, as you can see that document was secret and was only recently declassified, combined with forced migration that has informed the emergence of the Hmong refugee as ahistorical and non-geographic, in which Hmong do not belong anywhere. So this is then just a couple images of the early recruits of Hmong for the CIA during the war. So I won't go too much into this historical detail, but I can talk more about it in the Q&A. But this is just kind of set up my discussion of being a refugee means in terms of being diasporic and displaced, and how it relates to the politics of history. So in today's talk, I focus on Hmong-American literature as a site that emerges with how memories correspond to places, movement, and gendered racial identity. As mobile refugee bodies, Hmong traverse the different terrains of Laos, Thailand, and the US, carrying stories that help them navigate the colonial state-based boundaries that silence and fix Hmong histories. So rather than paint an idyllic picture of place, my discussion shows how a geographic locale can simultaneously represent home and a place of violence. It traces mobile Hmong refugee lives that are tied to running from place to place, as well as a yearning for a return to home. And as Indigenous and feminist scholar Mishwana Goldman notes, literature embodies our mobile and not fixed identities. So in short, in this short presentation, I look at 3 poems from this literary anthology, How Do I Begin? A Hmong-American literary anthology, to show how California's Central Valley serves as a mobile home and a site of unlikely collaborations. And I argue that the refugees' act of running renders Hmong-American literature mobile in a state of writing on the run. So the poems depict the Central Valley, especially Fresno, the poems that I've picked through the layered transmutations of home that vacillates between staying rooted and having to be on the run for refugees who have resettled here because the war violence from which they have escaped are also transplanted along with them. And a lot of the contributing authors to this anthology are actually from the Central Valley. And a lot of their writings, it's both poetry, short stories, and some visual art in the anthology is based in the Central Valley. So I look at these 2 poems by Andre Yang, which underscores home as a continuous loop of places through which Hmong refugees attempt to recreate a sense of belonging. So through the perspective of a Hmong youth, Yang creates vivid imagery of the new home in this poem, The Kingswood Garden Apartment Kid, on the right. That is a stark reminder of the girl's previous home, down to the renaming of the apartment as Ja Vinai, a name that she knows is reminiscent of this refugee camp, Ban Vinai refugee camp in Thailand, from which the family moved from. While the adults attempt to transplant the familiarity of the refugee camp to their new home in Fresno by renaming the Kingswood Garden Apartment Complex into Ja Vinai, the children are too busy indulging in their favorite pastime of, quote, jumping rope barefoot in the parking lot, end quote. The poem's rendition of an apartment kid who jumps rope barefoot and wipes her nose, streaking mucus across both cheeks, reflects the untidy innocence of childhood, but also conveys how children are left unattended to explore when adults are too busy trying to adjust to their temporary new home. The children's perspective conveys the continuous experiences of refugee displacement. Writing children's experiences captures the fluidity of home that gets refashioned through the familiarity of dirt stains and jumping rope. So here's a quote. The red stain on her shin is the San Joaquin River in June, a dried run from the scabs on her knees, end quote, is a connection of the body to earth, so that while the adults carry place names, their children dig into the dirt and connect to it through play. The jump rope metaphor, described as a whirling up and it's coming back down to signal the next chance she has to jump back in, signals the circular motion and path of homemaking for the refugee subject. Therefore, home is a relationship developed through dislocation, and in fact comprises a rehoming process of repositioning foreignness in relation to new cultural dwellings. So at the same time, refugee children's play can slip easily between the innocence of mucus-streaked face apartment kid to a young man's joyride, the other poem, turned into a police chase. So Yang's joyride, dedicated to Uncle CJ, sits on the opposite page from Kingswood, a Garden Apartment Kid, and narrates the tagging for turns between the jump rope players into a tag-along in somebody else's G-ride. This joyride of adolescent youth quickly turns into a police pursuit in which the protagonist must hide between carport wall and a beat-up Toyota Cressida while red and blue flashes spray the alleyway and helicopter searchlights frisk the Mayfair neighborhood crevices. This need to run and hide questions the supposed safety of this new home. The Central Valley region has the highest concentration of penitentiaries in the state of California that has disproportionately incarcerated young people of color. So Hmong, along with Black, Latino, and other Southeast Asian youth, become the targets of criminalization and imprisonment that subject them to social death. Survival and home are intertwined with the racialized masculinity that is too familiarly represented by the red and light blue fascists and helicopter searchlights of law enforcement. So hiding from the police conjures up the experiences of escape from Laos when you, quote, you clung tightly to your father's back, quiet as a whisper in water, end quote, making interchangeable the scenes of flight from war with those from the law. The convergence of the places of violence and refuge makes stark the precarity of home for the refugee subject. The war escapee and the young man hiding from the police enmesh the generational differences in escaping and running away. In contrast, the innocence of jumping rope, this youth's play as a tag-along, elevates the stakes of unbelonging. Home is an impossible place that is suspended between innocence and violence. The abandonment of refugees and immigrants' unintended children and gang police violence in the Central Valley come full circle in the work of Anthony Cody about shared histories and experiences. It opens the possibility for collaboration and affiliation across communities of color and writers of color. So moving on to this third poem that I'm looking at. The Hmong-American literary anthology demonstrates how a literary refugee studies may open up new connections relating to one another across geopolitical borders and racial boundaries. Cody's introduction to his contribution in the anthology illustrates how refugee literature's engagement with the meanings of place and home and belonging can highlight overlapping experiences. And he writes, quote, I hope to connect to tangents of the universal human experience and tie us to one another across oceans, borders, upbringing, and cultures. In this way, I find myself a Mexican-American writer from Southeast Fresno, contributing to a Hmong-American anthology as I attempt to echo the tragedies, routines, and reality of the life I share, end quote. Cody's work in a Hmong-American anthology disrupts the ethnic and racial boundaries that typically define such ethnic-based collections. Cody's poem, The Unattended, underscores the alien inattention to refugee youth by exploring the overlaps and interconnections shared between a Hmong-American and a Mexican-American schoolmate who only played together twice at recess. This unlikely relationship is forged between these two young children as they hold hands waiting for their respective family members to pick them up from school 4 hours after kindergarten dismissal. So both share the uncertainty of desertion that well up like puddles across the emptiness of the parking lot. And unlike the apartment complex parking lot where children play jump rope, this one at school is filled with abandonment. And I'm just gonna read or post up the last two stanzas of the poem for you to kind of look at as I talk through them. So when the narrator's grandfather finally shows up on a bicycle explaining that his mother had lost the keys, the walk home conjures up memories and stories of migration in the different but shared histories of entries to the United States. The grandfather explained leaving Mexico orphaned and traveling north to work on farms for 2 pennies a day. He prayed to the rosary on his journey when his body was racked with fever and was almost paralyzed. The friend Blanc related the story of a relative who was stricken with chills on the flight to America and dreamed of becoming a bird. The hallucinations and dreams brought on by fever and chills highlight the violence and dispossession that forced them to endure pain and peerless border crossings. They also symbolize the experiences of leaving as embodied processes that are deeply ingrained in the flesh. The struggle of straddling borders then get manifested in the body as illness. And so the sense of abandonment comes full circle to the beginning of the poem, where the two boys wait to be picked up. So this is, in these two stanzas, is where we find out why the Hmong-American child was not picked up. And it was because his older brother, who was supposed to pick him up, had been shot and killed. So Blanc's abandonment is revealed as a consequence of gang violence that resulted in the death of the brother who was supposed to pick him up. In the evening news, pictures of the ponytailed teenager, the footage of caution tape, and a family wailing against a coroner's van are made more poignant against the backdrop of the knowledge that this teenager is the one who picks up Blanc, and the wailing family is his. The often hyper-visible media imagery of violence gains new meaning through the shared knowledge of what it means to be unattended. This teenager might have escaped the violence of war and its aftermath of persecution to arrive in the US, but he did not make the journey of flight from systems of racism and poverty. Whereas some youth of color barely escaped the joyride from Yang's poem earlier, too many others are lost to the system. So the poem structure, in which the two boys' experiences of abandonment flank the passages about their family's border crossing, illustrates the well-remembered details of relatives' journeys that are often cited and become a part of everyday life. As such, refugee escape continues to be a part of their everyday lived experience, even for kindergarten-age children. The children or young adult perspectives presented in these poems offers a reflective yet unfiltered lens that help to configure a refugee aesthetic that is both poignant and urgent. Such perspectives reveal the persistent inequalities that make young men of color vulnerable to criminalization and incarceration, as well as open up what Jan Leesberg calls the emergent ties and lives produced within this crucible of US empire and race. So as the various poems show, running is a layered and ongoing condition of escaping from war and violence, eluding the police, and creating the conditions of possibility to exist. So it's this simultaneity of these contradictions that come together. So thank you.